hadn't taken a break in almost 2 years. Between work and personal things, life had turned into one long string of responsibilities and routines. I needed to get away, somewhere far, quiet, and remote. I searched online for cabins in the northern woods and found a listing for a small, off-grid place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. That's what drew me to it. The listing said it was about 20 miles down a dirt road. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no nearby houses. I booked it for a week and marked the days on the calendar. I packed simple clothes, tools, cooler full of food, a lantern, a good knife, my hatchet, a first aid kit, a .22 rifle for squirrels or snakes. I didn't plan to hunt, but I figured it was smart to have it. I left early on a Monday morning and reached the start of the dirt road before noon. I stopped to let some air out of the tires for traction, then followed the winding path through thick pine and spruce. It took me over an hour to reach the place. The road narrowed the deeper I went, turning from packed dirt to loose gravel, then to a narrow track just wide enough for the truck. Trees closed in on both sides and I slowed to a crawl. The cabin finally came into view on the other side of a shallow creek. A wooden plank bridge crossed it. I eased the truck over, tires crackling on the old boards. The cabin sat back in a clearing. It was small, maybe 25 feet long and 15 wide, with a rusty metal roof and faded cedar shingles. No porch, just 2 concrete steps leading to the front door. No other buildings, no vehicles, no sign of other people. Parked, stepped out and stretched. The air was cool, filled with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. The only sound was the breeze and birds. I checked the cabin, unlocked, just as the owner had said. Inside was one room with a small wood stove, a cot, a folding table, 2 chairs, a propane burner, and a metal wash basin. No electricity, no plumbing, just an outhouse down a short trail out back. It was perfect. I spent the rest of the day unloading, splitting kindling from some dry logs stacked along the back wall, and getting settled. I walked a short loop around the area, noting the terrain and checking for any signs of large animals or people. Nothing. That night, I built a small fire in the stove and sat with the door open, watching the woods darken. It was absolutely silent after the sun dropped. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. It was the kind that made your ears ring. I fell asleep easy but woke up around 3 a.m. It was completely dark inside. I lay still for a minute, heart thumping for no reason. It was like my body had sensed something before I'd woken up. I sat up, listened. Nothing, just my own breathing. I lit the lantern and looked around the cabin. Everything was just how I'd left it. I stepped outside. It was cold, quiet. I stood there for a few minutes, looking at the tree line. Then I went back in and slept the rest of the night. The next day, I hiked a few miles east, where the map showed a small lake. It was about a 45-minute hike, and the water was clear and shallow near the edge. I didn't see any signs of fish, but I marked the spot with a rock pile in case I wanted to come back. On the way back, I took a different route and found some old tire tracks, faded, almost overgrown. Not from my truck, and not recent. They led through a narrow clearing, then vanished. Probably from logging or someone coming through years ago. Back at the cabin, I cooked some rice and jerky on the burner, then sat out front until it got dark. I felt on edge for no reason. I told myself it was just being out of my element, away from people. Still, I double-checked the door latch that night. On the 3rd day, I explored farther north. The terrain got steeper, more rugged. Around midday, I saw something strange in a gully about a mile from the cabin. An old fire ring with charred wood in it. Not ancient, not fresh, maybe a couple weeks old. There were boot prints near it, smudged by rain and animals. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. There hadn't been any mention of other cabins nearby. The tracks weren't mine. I headed back and got to the cabin around 4. I walked a wide circle around it, checking for any signs I'd missed before. Near the back corner, about 15 feet from the wall, I found a broken branch with clean edges. Looked recent. Could have been an animal, I told myself. I didn't sleep well that night. Woke up twice. The second time I thought I heard something outside. Maybe sticks snapping. I stayed still and listened, but it didn't repeat. I finally got up and lit the lantern. Nothing outside but the wind. On the fourth day, I stayed close to the cabin. I sharpened the hatchet, cleaned the rifle, reorganized some gear. I started paying more attention to sounds. Noticed how loud squirrels and chipmunks could be, how the wind made branches knock and creak. It made me wonder how easily something or someone could move out there and not be noticed. The trees were dense enough to hide anything. Later that afternoon, I walked back to the creek and saw something that stopped me cold. On the muddy bank, not more than 20 yards from the bridge, were footprints. Human, barefoot, long, narrow prints in the mud, leading from the water into the trees. Not mine. Too fresh. The edges were still wet. I stood there for a long time trying to figure out what to do. I walked back to the cabin fast but steady, constantly looking over my shoulder. Once inside, I locked the door and closed the shutters. I took the rifle out and kept it loaded beside me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair with the lantern low, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard something move outside. No mistaking it this time. It was slow, steady, like someone walking through leaves, then stopping. The sound came from the back of the cabin. I stood up and held the rifle ready. I didn't move for almost 10 minutes. Then a single thump against the back wall. I held my breath. It was followed by total silence. I waited until dawn before I opened the door. I checked around the cabin. At the back wall, right below the small window, were fresh prints in the dirt. Bare feet again. They led to the wall and back toward the trees. I didn't know what to do. Leaving meant driving that narrow road for miles, and if someone was out there watching, I'd be exposed. But staying felt worse. I decided to wait until midday, pack fast, and leave. I loaded everything except my rifle into the truck, then stood in the doorway and scanned the woods. I didn't see anything. I got in, turned the key, and started driving. I made it over the bridge and halfway up the road before I had to slow down to crawl over a washed-out spot. That's when I saw it just off to the right in the trees. A man, tall, thin, maybe in his 40s, wearing no shirt, just jeans. Standing still, not looking away. His skin was pale, almost gray. He wasn't hiding. He just stood there and watched me pass. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove all the way out without stopping, made it to the highway, and didn't pull over until I hit the first gas station almost 2 hours later. I sat there for 20 minutes with the engine running. I reported it to the sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone to check. A week later, I called for an update. They said they'd found the cabin, but no signs of anyone else. No prints, no signs of trespass. They said maybe it was a local off-grid person or someone passing through. I don't know what he was doing out there, why he never tried to talk or chase or hide. But something about him, his stillness, his silence, it didn't feel like a random encounter. Felt like he was waiting, watching. The longer I think about it, the more I realize how isolated I was, how easy it would have been for someone to disappear out there. I never went back. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I still dream about that man sometimes, always in the same place, just off the road, standing there, watching. And that's what gets me the most. It wasn't what he did. It's what he didn't do. He just waited, like he had all the time in the world, like he'd done it before, and maybe next time he wouldn't wait. I decided to stay in my uncle's old cabin in the mountains after he passed. It had been sitting and used for years. No one in the family wanted to go up there, not because of any particular reason, just because it was remote and the kind of place that demanded a certain tolerance for solitude. I needed space to clear my head after quitting my job, and it seemed like the right place for it. I thought a few weeks in the quiet might help me reset. The cabin was about 40 miles from the nearest town, and the last 10 miles were rough, steep dirt roads that hadn't seen a grader in decades. Took me the better part of 2 hours to get up there, even with four-wheel drive. The trees grew thicker as the road climbed, and eventually, the forest closed in so tight the sunlight barely touched the trail. There was no phone signal by the time I passed the halfway mark. The cabin sat in a small clearing about 100 yards off the road, surrounded on all sides by pine and spruce. It wasn't very big, maybe 20 by 30 feet. One room, old with siding, a pitched tin roof. The windows were small and high up, the kind that let in light but not much of a view. There was a narrow porch with a crooked step and a rusted axe embedded in the chopping block out front. Behind the cabin was a wood shed, mostly empty, and an old outhouse further down a slope. I arrived just before dusk. The air was cold and dry, and the place smelled like old timber and pine sap. It had that quiet you only find deep in the woods. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just wind in the branches and the occasional sound of a bird. The silence was almost overwhelming after so much time in the city. Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact. A cast iron stove, a small table, 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner with a pile of musty blankets folded on top. I aired it out, opened the windows, and swept the floor. There was a trapdoor near the center which led down to a root cellar. I checked it, just dirt walls, old shelves, and a few empty mason jars. Nothing strange. That first night, I lit a fire in the stove and sat in the only chair that didn't wobble. I had a paperback novel, a thermos of coffee, and the kind of quiet that let my thoughts breathe. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. I fell asleep early and woke up once around 3 a.m. Not because of any noise, just because I wasn't used to the cold and the stillness. I lay there for a long time listening to nothing. Absolute silence. The next few days followed a quiet routine. I chopped some wood, cleared brush, read, made simple meals on the camp stove. The weather held, clear skies during the day, freezing temperatures at night. I hiked during the afternoons, slowly working outwards from the cabin. The land rose sharply in all directions, covered in dense woods and large rocks. There was no real trail, just faint paths made by deer or erosion. On the 4th day, I found something about a mile out that gave me pause. A small campsite tucked into a shallow ravine, down near a dry creek bed. A tarp strung between trees, a ring of stones from an old fire, an empty can of beans, and a melted toothbrush. It wasn't recent, maybe from the summer before, but it was human and it wasn't mine. I looked around, scanned the brush, and found nothing else. No bag, no tools, no tent. It didn't feel right. It looked abandoned, not packed up. I made a note of where it was and moved on. That night, back at the cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The toothbrush bothered me the most. It wasn't something people usually leave behind, especially if they're coming back. I started noticing little things. On the 5th morning, I saw that some of the wood I'd stacked beside the porch had been knocked over. Could have been the wind or a raccoon. I res-tacked it, didn't think much of it. Later that day, while hiking near the ridge, I saw footprints in the dirt. Human, worn boot treads, narrow, pointing toward the cabin from the south. I hadn't come from that direction, and I hadn't seen them earlier in the week. The prints looked old, but not ancient. I didn't sleep well that night. The woods felt closer than usual. Around 1 a.m., I heard a soft knock, like something tapping lightly on the outer wall. Not the wind. 3 slow taps, then nothing. I waited, heart pounding, trying to tell myself it was a branch or a squirrel. I didn't get up. I stayed frozen under the blanket, staring at the ceiling until the sky turned gray with morning. I spent the 6th day fixing the lock on the door and boarding up the windows from the inside. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been near the cabin. I thought about hiking back to the truck and driving out, but I also felt like I'd be abandoning something I couldn't quite name. Like if I left now, I'd never come back, and I'd always wonder. That afternoon, I hiked out to the old campsite again. Nothing had changed. I dug around the fire pit with a stick and found part of a burnt boot sole buried under the ashes. No bones or clothes, just that. It made the whole thing feel even stranger. Why leave shoes behind? Back at the cabin, I kept the fire low and sat in the dark. Around midnight, I heard the same sound, tapping. But this time, it was followed by a faint creaking, like weight shifting on the porch step. I grabbed the axe and waited behind the door. I didn't open it. I didn't move. Eventually, the noise stopped. I slept during the day after that and stayed awake at night. I kept the lights off, watched the windows. On the 8th day, I saw something in the trees to the west, a figure just standing behind a tree, half visible. Far enough I couldn't make out details, but close enough to know it was a person. I stared for a long time. The figure never moved. I turned to grab the rifle, and when I looked back, it was gone. That was the final straw. I packed everything I could carry and decided to leave at dawn. I didn't sleep. At first light, I grabbed my pack and walked fast down the trail to where the truck was parked. Everything looked the same, but as I opened the truck door, I noticed something. The glove box was open. Papers were scattered across the floor. Someone had been inside. I got in and locked the doors. The key turned. The engine cranked, then sputtered. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood and looked. Nothing obvious. No cut wires, no missing parts. Just wouldn't start. I sat there for a long time thinking. Eventually, I decided to hike out. I took the main trail down the mountain, a winding path I hadn't used before. About 5 miles down, I found a small hunting cabin. Locked, empty, but with a solar panel and a working radio. I called for help. Search and rescue showed up 4 hours later. They asked me a lot of questions. I told them about the tapping, the figure, the footprints. They searched the area, found the same campsite I had. Said it looked like someone had squatted there for a while, maybe a drifter or a hiker who got lost. They never found the person. My truck was towed out a week later. Mechanics said the fuel line had been stuffed with mud and pine needles. Not an accident. I haven't gone back. There was no big event. No fight. No body. Just signs. A toothbrush. A footprint. A broken shoe. Taps on the wall in the middle of the night. But whoever it was, someone had been watching that cabin for a long time. They never tried to get in. They never attacked. They just waited, night after night, tapping on the wall, stepping on the porch, messing with my things, watching. And the scariest part? They're probably still up there, still waiting. Maybe for the next person who thinks being alone in the woods sounds peaceful. I rented the cabin for 6 days. That's how long I planned to stay. I'd taken the week off work months in advance, thinking I'd use the time to relax and do some hunting before the cold really set in. I chose a spot in northern Vermont, near a place called Avery's Notch, which was far enough from anything civilized that I figured I'd have the woods to myself. I'd hunted in the area once before with a friend years ago and remembered it being remote, quiet, and thick with whitetail. The cabin was an old one-room place, basic but decent. It was owned by some guy who worked as a logger in the summers and rented out the place in the fall to solo hunters or small groups. No electricity, just a wood stove, a propane lantern, a cot, and a small folding table. There was a pump about 100 feet out back for water, and an old outhouse beyond that. It sat on a slight hill just off a trail that barely counted as a road, and you had to park about a quarter mile away and walk in. I didn't mind that. Less traffic, less people. I arrived just after noon on a Sunday. It was cold and damp, and the sky had that thick, gray look that told me rain wasn't far off. The leaves were nearly gone from the trees, and what was left was plastered to the ground, soggy and brown. I unloaded the truck fast, packed my gear into my hunting bag, and hiked up to the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while, but it was dry inside, and the stove worked. That was enough. The first evening passed without much to note. I cleaned up a little, unpacked, and made a simple meal. Then I sat near the stove and listened to the wind come through the trees. The place was dead silent otherwise. No traffic, no neighbors, just forest and wind. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I had scouted a small ridge about a mile northwest of the cabin back when I came through this area years ago, and I wanted to get up there before light. The trail was faint, more a suggestion than a path, but I knew the lay of the land well enough not to worry. I moved slow, quiet, keeping my eyes open and ears tuned in for movement. I didn't see anything that first day, though I did find some decent sign. Tracks, some scat, even a fresh rub on a young sapling. That told me a buck was working the area, which gave me some hope. I stayed out until the light started fading, then made my way back to the cabin. I hadn't seen a single person all day. No distant gunshots. No other signs of hunters. I liked it that way. I don't go out to socialize. I go out to be alone. I made another meal, stoked the fire, and got some sleep. The second day started about the same. I went in a different direction this time, more eastward, where the woods grew dense and the ground turned soft. It was quieter than the ridge, and I figured if the deer were bedded down somewhere, it'd be there. I found a small game trail and followed it for about an hour before I stopped to rest. That's when I saw something that made me stop chewing the piece of jerky I had in my mouth. A bright orange piece of fabric was hanging on a low branch up ahead. I assumed at first it was just a marker, maybe someone tied it there last season. But when I got closer, I saw it was the sleeve of a hunting jacket, torn, faded, still hooked around the branch like someone had pushed through the trees too fast and ripped it off. The material looked older, weather-worn. That wasn't the part that got to me. What got to me was the dried brown smear that ran across it. I couldn't say for sure what it was. Maybe mud, maybe blood. It wasn't fresh, but something about the way the sleeve was hooked around that branch, like it had been yanked, made the back of my neck go cold. I stood there for a while, listening, but the woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a warning. I took a photo of the jacket sleeve with my phone, even though I didn't have a signal out there, then kept moving. I figured if someone had been hurt out here, it must have been a long time ago. Still, I scanned the trees more carefully after that. I kept my head on a swivel. I made it back to the cabin a little before dusk. Quick, stoked the stove, but I didn't sleep great that night. Every sound outside had me lifting my head off the cot. Branches cracking, wind pressing against the roof. Once, I swore I heard footsteps in the leaves. I sat up, flashlight in hand, holding my breath, but there was nothing, just wind again. On the third morning, I woke up late. I didn't go far. My legs were sore from the first 2 days, and I figured I'd still hunt around the base of the ridge instead of climbing again. I moved slow, scanning for sign, stopping often. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards off the trail was a deadfall, a big cluster of fallen branches and old trees piled up, and wedged halfway under the pile was something orange, bright. I stepped off the trail and pushed through the brush. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It was another jacket, but this one was newer, less faded, still muddy and stiff, and this one was still being worn. Whoever it belonged to was lying face down under the deadfall, one leg twisted under the other, one boot missing. The jacket was torn badly down the back. I couldn't see the person's face, and I didn't try to move them. My stomach sank like a stone. I didn't have a signal on my phone, but I took a photo. I made a mental note of my location, checked the GPS I carried for NAV, and turned back toward the cabin. It was a slow walk back. My hands were shaking a little, and my stomach had that tight, nervous feeling that makes your throat dry. I didn't know what I'd found. An old body, maybe. Some hunter who got caught in a storm or got lost. Maybe a bear. But the fact that the jacket looked newer and there were no signs of an animal eating at the body, it bothered me. A lot. When I got back to the cabin, the first thing I did was pack some of my gear. I was gonna hike out to the truck and drive into the next town to report it. I figured it was probably 20 miles to the nearest station, but that didn't matter. I wasn't sleeping another night out there. Then I saw it. Pinned to the front door of the cabin was a strip of orange fabric. Same material as the jacket I'd found. It had been wedged into the crack between the door and the frame. I stared at it for a long time before I pulled it free. There was no note, no markings, just the fabric, torn and stiff. I opened the cabin door, grabbed the rest of my stuff, and left. The walk to the truck was fast. I was breathing hard, sweating despite the cold. I kept turning around, checking the trees behind me. I never saw anyone, never heard anything, but I felt it, that pressure, that sense that I wasn't alone. When I got to the truck, the driver's side door was open, not wide, just cracked. I hadn't left it like that. I knew I hadn't. Inside, everything was untouched, nothing stolen, but I noticed that on the passenger seat, placed carefully and neatly, was a folded piece of bright orange cloth. Another sleeve. I drove fast, didn't stop, didn't check my mirrors more than I had to. I reached the nearest town, pulled into a gas station, and used the payphone to call the sheriff. I told him what I'd found, gave the location as best I could. I didn't stick around. I didn't want to answer questions. I just wanted to be away from there. A week later, I got a call from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. A man's voice, flat. "We didn't find anyone. No body, no jacket, nothing. You sure about the location?" I deleted the message. I haven't gone hunting since. I sold my gear. The photos I took, I deleted them. I don't want reminders. But sometimes, when I walk out to my garage late at night, I swear I catch the scent of damp leaves, of cold earth. And once, just once, I found a strip of orange cloth wedged into the crack of the side door. I threw it away without opening it. And I keep the lights on now, always. I booked the cabin on a late Thursday afternoon in early November. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing, not really, but it was close. I had a week off work and no one to spend it with, and I figured some quiet time away from people would do me some good. I found the listing on a site that specializes in remote properties. The pictures showed a solid wood frame structure nestled between trees on a slope. It looked clean, secluded. The price was cheap, probably because it was already late in the season and it was a long hike from the parking spot. It was in the Adirondacks, tucked away beyond an old service road that looked barely traveled. I had to park almost half a mile away and carry my things in. There was a wagon at the trailhead, left by the owner for guests to haul their stuff. That was the first good sign, a touch of preparedness. I threw my duffel bag, food tote, water, and propane heater in and started walking. The hike in took about 25 minutes. Not bad, just slow going because the trail was slick with wet leaves and steep in places. I didn't see anyone on the way in. That was fine by me. I wanted the place to myself. When I got to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I don't mean regular quiet, I mean absolutely still. No birds, no wind in the trees, not even the hum of insects. It was the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. The sky was overcast, flat gray, and the trees were mostly bare, their twisted limbs reaching in every direction. The cabin itself looked like the pictures. Solid wood, maybe cedar, with a small front porch, one shuttered window, and a black metal chimney poking out of the roof. The door was locked with a padlock, and the key was under a loose board on the porch like the owner had said. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and shut the door behind me. The inside was one large room with a wood-burning stove on one side, a twin bed with a thick quilt on the other, a basic kitchenette, and a heavy old freezer sitting by the back wall. That freezer caught my eye right away, not because it didn't belong, but because it had two padlocks on it. Big ones, the kind you'd use to lock up a storage unit. One on each corner of the lid. The owner hadn't mentioned the freezer in the listing. I checked the email exchange just to be sure, but there was nothing about it. I figured it was just for food storage and the locks were there to keep animals out. Still, I tried to lift the lid just out of curiosity. Locked tight. I dropped my stuff on the bed, cracked open a window for some air, and started settling in. That night, I made a simple meal, just canned soup heated on the propane stove, and ate while sitting near the fire. The stove worked well. It got the room warm in no time. I brought a small radio that picked up weather stations, and I tuned it just enough to hear the forecast. Cold. Maybe some snow in the next 2 days. That didn't bother me. I had food and heat. I slept okay the first night. The bed wasn't the best, and the silence outside was heavy, but I didn't have trouble falling asleep. I woke up around 3 a.m. to pee and stepped outside. That's when I noticed the light. A dull, flickering orange glow through the trees to the east. Far enough that it looked distant, but close enough that I could see the movement. It looked like a small fire. My first thought was campers. Maybe someone else was out here after all. But I didn't hear anything. No voices, no movement. Just the fire glow between the trees. I stood on the porch watching it for about 10 minutes. It never grew or faded, just stayed flickering. Eventually I got cold and went back inside. When I woke up in the morning, it was gone. The next day I went for a walk in that direction. Not to be nosy, just curious. I didn't find anything. No ashes, no fire pit, no tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, so if someone had been through, there should have been some sign of it. But there was nothing, just wet leaves and bare branches. Back at the cabin, I spent the day reading and walking short trails. I cooked a better meal, pasta and tuna, and sat by the fire again. I found myself staring at the freezer more than I liked. Something about it felt off. The padlocks were big and clean, newer than the rest of the cabin. The freezer itself was old. Chipped paint, rusted edges, heavy-duty kind they don't make anymore. It wasn't plugged in. There was no power in the cabin. So why keep it locked? I tried not to think about it. Maybe it was storage for something weird, animal bait, maybe even game meat from a past hunt. Still, I didn't like the way it sat there in the corner, just out of the firelight. That night, I heard something. Not inside, outside. It was slow and steady, a soft drag and crunch, like something being pulled through the leaves. Then a bump, like something hitting the porch steps. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The fire had died down, and the room was dim. I didn't move. I just listened. The dragging sound came again, this time closer, then silence. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, but it was probably 15 minutes. Finally, I moved to the window, cracked the shutter, and looked out. The woods were dark. Nothing moved. I didn't see anything on the porch. No tracks. Nothing unusual. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. Still no tracks. I walked down the trail toward the parking spot, just to reassure myself. When I got to the trailhead, I found something that made me stop. The wagon was gone. I left it just off the trail where the ground was flat. I remember that clearly because I'd had trouble lifting the back wheel over a root. But now it was gone. I searched around, thinking maybe it had rolled or been moved by animals. But there were no drag marks, no tire grooves, nothing. I walked back to the cabin, a little more on edge. I didn't feel watched, not exactly, but the woods felt different, too still again. Even the usual background noise of the trees seemed faded. That evening, while boiling water for tea, I heard a loud thud from the back wall. It was sudden, sharp, not like a tree branch falling, more like something hitting the wood hard. I froze, turned off the stove, and stood there listening. Nothing followed, just one impact. I walked over to the back window, slid it open, and leaned out. That's when I saw the locks on the freezer were gone. Both padlocks, gone. And the lid was open a few inches. I didn't move. My mouth went dry. I looked around the room slowly. Nothing else seemed out of place. No broken glass. No marks on the door. I walked up to the freezer carefully and leaned down to look inside. It was empty. No shelves. No insulation. Just a hollow metal box with rusted corners and a faint sour smell. I checked the floor around it. Nothing. No footprints. No scratches. The locks were nowhere to be seen. I shut the lid and pushed a chair on top of it. It didn't make sense, but I didn't care. I needed a barrier. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with my boots on and the fire high, watching the corners of the room. At some point, near dawn, I must have drifted off. I woke up to a cold stove and gray light through the window. I stood, stretched, and opened the door to get air. That's when I saw what was sitting on the porch. A boot, one of mine, covered in mud and full of water, propped up against the door like a delivery. I backed inside, shut the door, and locked it. I checked my bag. My boots were there, both of them, dry, clean. The one on the porch wasn't mine. I didn't know what to do. My phone still had no signal. I considered hiking out, but the trail was long and the day was already cold. I gave myself one more night. I'd leave in the morning, first light. I packed everything, laid my gear by the door, and kept the stove going as long as I could. At some point, I must have fallen asleep again, because I woke up to darkness, and the freezer lid wide open. The chair had been moved, not knocked over, moved, set aside like someone had gently lifted it and placed it on the floor. I didn't go near it. Instead, I picked up my bag, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold. I didn't care about food or the fire. I just needed to be away. Halfway down the trail, I heard something behind me, a dragging sound. I didn't look back. I ran. When I got to the car, I threw my gear in, started the engine, and took off. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I drove straight through the night back home. Later, I reported it. I called the number on the rental listing and left a message. A deputy called me back a week later, said they went up and checked the property. There was no cabin, just a foundation and some collapsed beams. Said the place had burned down 3 years ago in a storm. No rentals, no owners, no listings. I sent him the link to the website. It was gone. So was the email chain. So was the charge on my credit card. Nothing remained. Nothing traceable. Just a memory. And sometimes, when I go into my garage at night, I find one of my boots moved, just slightly, facing the door, waiting. It started because I needed to get away from people. I'd been living in the city for too long, constantly surrounded by traffic, sirens, yelling, and just the feeling of being boxed in. I worked in a small office in a tall glass building, staring at spreadsheets all day, nodding through meetings that went nowhere, trying to stay polite while every muscle in my body tensed like I was about to snap. So when I finally built up the nerve to ask for 3 weeks off, I knew I wasn't going to spend it near anyone. I booked a cabin up north. It was supposed to be secluded, something I made sure of. It wasn't on Airbnb or any big rental site. I found it through a buried message board post from a guy who inherited it from his grandfather and didn't care what happened to it as long as the renter didn't trash it. It was cheap, and he said it had everything I needed. A wood stove, a generator, a small water tank, a radio, and plenty of dry firewood. No phone service, no Wi-Fi, no one else around. I sent him a money order, got directions scribbled on a scanned piece of paper, and packed enough food and fuel for 3 weeks. I left my phone behind on purpose. The drive up took most of a day. The cabin was buried way back on an old Forest Service road that hadn't been maintained in years. I had to park my truck about half a mile from the place and hike the rest in with my gear. When I got to it, I was already sweating under my jacket, legs tired from trudging through uneven brush. The cabin was small, old, and exactly what I wanted. Just wood, steel, and quiet. No one for miles. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine, smoke, and mouse droppings. There were 2 chairs, a wooden table, a narrow cot with a wool blanket, and a cast iron stove. A lantern hung from the rafters, and there were matches in a metal tin beside the door. Everything was dusty, but usable. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up when I wanted. I drank coffee by the stove. I read old paperbacks I'd brought, or just stared out the window at the snow through the trees. It was late winter, but the weather was still cold. The wind was constant up there, whispering through the trees, nudging the walls and roof with soft creaks. I'd go out each day and explore a little, maybe a mile in each direction, careful to mark my trail with notches in the bark or sticks I laid down. There was no trail, just dense forest, and I didn't want to lose my way. One night, about a week in, I was lying on the cot trying to fall asleep. The wind had died down, and it was silent except for the occasional pop of the fire. Then I heard something outside. It was soft, like a crunch in the snow. I sat up and listened. Another crunch, slow, deliberate, not like a deer, which moves lightly and unpredictably. This was spaced out, steady, like someone walking. I stayed still. My heart beat a little faster, but I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a moose. I knew bears were hibernating, and wolves wouldn't come this close. I hadn't seen any tracks that big either. After a while, the sound stopped, and I finally drifted off. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. There were prints in the snow. Not shoe prints, but deep, round depressions like a large boot with no tread. They led from the trees toward the cabin, stopped about 15 feet away, and then turned back around. No clear path in, just a wandering line like someone had come to take a look and then changed their mind. I stared at them for a while, trying to decide if I was reading too much into it, but it didn't sit right. I hadn't seen any signs of people since I arrived. No tire tracks, no fire pits, no trash. I decided maybe I was being paranoid. Still, I started keeping the axe beside my bed instead of by the door. A couple of nights later, I woke up again. No noise this time, just a feeling. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. I got up, lit the lantern, and looked around. The fire had burned low, so I added more wood and crouched near it. I listened. Outside, nothing, just stillness. But in the morning, when I went to grab more firewood from the stack behind the cabin, I found the back window was cracked open, just a half inch. It hadn't been that way before. I never opened that window, it was stiff, and I jammed it shut with a wedge the first day because it kept creaking. Now the wedge was on the ground, and the window had fresh scratches near the latch, like someone had used a tool to pry it loose. Inside, nothing seemed stolen or moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there. After that, I started locking the door during the day and keeping the hatchet with me even when I went to relieve myself out back. I checked every window before bed. I still hadn't seen anyone, but I knew something was off. I started to think maybe I'd wandered onto someone's old land and they didn't want me there. Maybe some hunter or squatter was trying to scare me off. 3 days later, I found the tracks again. This time, they went straight up to the cabin, right up to the door. They circled around it. Then they disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed awake near the fire with the axe across my lap, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. I kept telling myself if someone wanted to hurt me, they would have done it by now. But that logic didn't bring much comfort. The scariest thing wasn't the footsteps. It was the quiet. Whoever was out there, if it was a person, they knew the land better than me. They knew how to move quietly, how to get close without being seen. They weren't rushing it. They were watching. One morning, I woke up and found the door slightly ajar. I always latched it. Always. I even pressed against it twice before bed to be sure it was secure. But now it was open about 2 inches, just wide enough to let in cold air. I checked everything inside. Again, nothing missing. Nothing moved. But on the floor, right by the doorway, was a small pine cone. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. It sat perfectly upright, like it had been placed there carefully. It wasn't a threat, not like a knife or something broken, but it felt like a message, like someone wanted me to know they could come and go as they pleased. I thought about leaving, packing my stuff and hiking out to the truck, but I told myself I wouldn't run. This trip was supposed to be about facing discomfort, about disconnecting from everything. And even though I was scared, a part of me didn't want to give up. That stubborn piece of pride kept me there. But I made changes. I moved the table in front of the door at night. I kept the axe and a hunting knife close. I stopped walking far during the day, just short loops around the cabin, checking for prints. I even built a simple tripwire around the backside using fishing line and empty cans. Anything to give me a heads up. A few nights passed with nothing. Then one evening, just before dusk, I noticed something strange in the trees. About 40 yards out, through the branches, I saw a shape. Not moving, just standing there. At first, I thought it was a tree stump, but when I looked through the binoculars I brought, I saw it was a person, standing still, wearing dark clothing, face partly covered by a hood or scarf. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I stared back for maybe 5 minutes, heart pounding. Then I turned to grab the axe. When I looked again, they were gone. That night, I barely blinked. I kept the fire low and sat with my back to the wall. Around 2 a.m., I heard the tripwire rattle. Not break, just rattle, like someone touched it gently. I didn't go out to check. I just sat there, gripping the axe so tight my hand cramped. When the sky finally turned gray and the light came back, I stepped outside. The fishing line was still up, but one of the cans was missing. It had been clipped cleanly from the wire and placed in the center of the clearing about 20 feet away. Like a souvenir. That was it for me. I decided I was done. I packed everything fast, took only what I needed and left behind whatever was too heavy. I didn't even try to clean up. I threw my bag on and hiked straight for the truck without stopping, axe in hand the whole time. When I got there, everything looked untouched. I started the engine and didn't look back. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? that someone had been watching me but never attacked, that they left pine cones and cans like breadcrumbs. It wasn't illegal to walk through the woods. There was no evidence, nothing to investigate, just fear. But the worst part is this: I don't think they wanted to hurt me. I think they just wanted to watch, to prove that they could get close, that they were in control. And knowing there are people out there who live in that space between curiosity and malice is harder to deal with than any threat. Sometimes I wake up at night and feel like someone is in the room, not making noise, just watching. I know it's in my head. At least I hope it is. I haven't gone camping since. I hadn't planned on staying at a cabin that weekend. It was a last-minute thing. A guy I knew through a friend offered it to me after I told him I needed to get out of town for a while. I was between jobs, between places to live, and just generally in a weird headspace. He said the cabin was quiet, out in the woods near a small lake, and that I could stay there as long as I wanted. I only had to bring my own supplies, and I'd have peace and quiet to clear my head. I figured, why not? I'd spent enough time staring at the same four walls of my friend's spare room. I was getting restless. The drive out there was long, mostly two-lane roads that wound through forested hills, small patches of farmland, and towns that looked like they hadn't grown in decades. I didn't mind the drive. I liked being alone in the car with music playing low, just thinking and watching the trees pass. The directions were printed out because there was barely any signal after a certain point. The last hour or so was on gravel roads, narrowing until it was more of a dirt path than a road. I got there late in the afternoon. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just one level with a small porch out front. The wood was weathered, the steps creaked, but everything looked solid enough. There was a padlock on the door. The key had been left in a sealed envelope taped under the porch railing, just like he said. Inside was simple: a main room with a wood stove and some mismatched furniture, a tiny kitchen with an old gas range and a sink that ran off a hand pump, a small bathroom with a composting toilet, and one bedroom with a double bed and a small closet. No electricity, no running water besides what you pumped yourself. There was a small shed out back with firewood and tools. I found a solar lantern, some candles, and a few canned goods in the cupboard. It was rustic, but it would do. I unloaded my gear, set up my sleeping bag over the mattress, and put my food and water in the cooler I'd brought. I didn't have a cell signal. That made me nervous at first, but I told myself that was the whole point. I had enough food and supplies to last a week if I rationed properly. After that, I'd reassess. The silence out there was thick. No hum of traffic, no voices, just birds and the wind in the trees. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, heated up a can of chili, and sat on the porch with a book until it got too dark to read. I didn't even need to light the lantern. The moon was nearly full, and it spilled over the clearing around the cabin like pale blue light. I sat there a long time just listening. You don't realize how loud the world is until you're someplace that doesn't make any noise at all. I slept surprisingly well that night. The woods creaked and popped a little, which was to be expected. Mice or raccoons or branches shifting in the wind. Nothing that got me out of bed. The second day, I explored the area. There was a trail down to the lake, about 10 minutes through the woods. The lake was small and still, with clear water and a narrow bank. I didn't see any boats or docks or signs of people. I sat there for a while with my feet in the water, skipping stones and just watching the surface. A deer came down to drink at one point. It looked up at me but didn't run. On the way back to the cabin, I spotted an old fence line mostly hidden by undergrowth. It looked like part of a property line. I followed it for a little ways but lost it where the brush got too thick. I figured the cabin sat on what used to be a much larger property. That evening, I made a fire in the pit outside and cooked a couple hot dogs over the flames. I heard owls later and something bigger moving out in the woods, probably a raccoon or a deer again. I wasn't worried. I had a flashlight, a decent pocket knife, and a whistle clipped to my jacket just in case I got lost. I kept a small hatchet near the door too. Not because I expected trouble, just because it made me feel a little safer. It was on the third night that things got strange. I had turned in early after reading for a while. I was lying in bed with the blankets pulled up, lantern off, room dark except for the faint moonlight through the curtains. I heard what I thought was a branch snapping outside. Not unusual, but then I heard it again, a sharper crack, and then a second one closer. It was footsteps. I sat up, heart thumping, and listened. 2 more steps, heavy, crunching leaves. I stayed perfectly still. The footsteps moved slowly, around the side of the cabin, pausing now and then. I imagined it was a bear, maybe, or a large deer, but bears didn't walk like that, not with measured, heavy steps, and they didn't pause like they were listening. I crept out of bed, picked up the flashlight, and moved to the window without turning it on. I carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to peek through. I didn't see anything at first, just shadows and trees. Then I saw it. A figure, human. It was standing near the corner of the cabin, maybe 20 feet away, half hidden by the edge of the porch. No flashlight, no gear, just standing there, still. My mouth went dry. I ducked back behind the curtain. I waited, listening. The footsteps moved again, slow and deliberate. I couldn't tell if they were circling or leaving. I waited a long time before I finally turned the flashlight on and checked the windows again. Nothing. The rest of the night, I barely slept. Every sound made me flinch. I kept the flashlight and hatchet beside me on the bed. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a hunter or maybe even just a trick of the light. Maybe I imagined it. I had been stressed, tired, but I still walked the perimeter of the cabin after the sun came up. That's when I found the prints. In the soft dirt under one of the side windows. Boots, not mine. Someone had been there. I thought about leaving. I really did. But something made me stay. Maybe pride. Maybe denial. Maybe I just didn't want to admit that I wasn't comfortable being alone out there. I didn't go far that day. I stayed near the cabin, kept my fire going, and kept the hatchet close. I started locking the door with the padlock from the inside at night, even though the cabin didn't really have strong locks. It wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. Nothing happened the next night, but on the 5th day, I went to the lake again. It felt safer during the day. I walked the trail, tried to relax. When I got back, I noticed something odd. The firewood I stacked beside the porch was scattered, like someone kicked it. A few pieces were farther out, half buried in leaves. That night, I set a trap of sorts. I took a tin cup and balanced it on top of the door handle. It would fall if anyone touched the knob. I also left the lantern on low, just to keep a little light in the main room. At some point during the night, I heard the cup fall. I jolted up, grabbed the flashlight, and stayed completely still. There were no footsteps this time, just silence. I waited a full 5 minutes before moving. Then I turned the flashlight on, slowly opened the bedroom door, and looked out. The cup was on the floor. The door handle had been jostled. I checked every window. I didn't see anyone, but they had tried to open the door. The next morning, I packed my gear. I didn't even eat breakfast. I loaded everything into the car and started down the dirt road. But about 10 minutes in, I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the road. It was too big to move. It hadn't been there before. There was no wind the night before, no storm. It looked like it had been cut, not broken. The cut was rough, like from a handsaw. The ends weren't clean. I didn't have a chainsaw, just a small hand axe and a folding saw. It would take hours to clear. I backed up to the cabin, locked the car, and tried to figure out what to do. There was no signal, no landline. I could hike out, but it would take most of the day, and I wasn't sure which direction led to a main road. I decided to stay one more night and start hiking out at first light. I barely slept. I kept the fire going, kept my gear packed. Every noise set me on edge. At one point, I heard footsteps again, but they didn't come close. In the morning, I set out on foot. I left a note on the door, just in case someone came by. I hiked for hours. My legs ached. I kept expecting someone to step out from the trees, but no one did. Eventually, I hit a gravel road, then a paved road. I flagged down a pickup truck. The guy gave me a lift to the nearest town. I reported what happened to the sheriff's office. They sent someone to check the cabin. When they got there, the door was wide open. My note was gone. They didn't find anyone. They moved the tree and drove my car back to town. I never went back to get the rest of my gear. I didn't care. I stayed with a friend, then found a cheap apartment in the city. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but someone knew I was alone. Someone watched me, and they wanted me to stay, or they wanted me gone. Either way, I was lucky to get out. I don't go to cabins anymore. I don't camp alone, and I don't ignore my instincts, because someone was out there and they were real, and I don't think they were just passing through. I needed to be alone. That's how it started. I was worn down, fried from too many hours at work, too much noise, too much city, and too many people. Everything started feeling like static in my head, like I was being swallowed by the same loop every day. I just wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere far off. So I rented a cabin deep in the northern woods, way off any paved road, away from towns and people. A place without service. No internet, no signal, just trees and silence. It was early October. Leaves were turning, but the air was still mild. Not freezing yet, but you could feel the shift, that bite in the wind at night. I found the listing online, a bare-bones, single-bedroom place up near an old, mostly dried-out lake. It had a wood stove, a well for water, a propane tank for cooking, and nothing else. The ad said, secluded and perfect for recharging, which sounded right. I booked it for 10 days. The drive up took longer than expected. I passed through a few towns I'd never heard of, followed a gravel road for almost 40 minutes, then a dirt path that went on, barely wide enough for my truck. At one point, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, but eventually I saw a wooden sign nailed to a post, mostly overgrown. It just said Miller's Point. That was the place. The cabin sat about 50 yards off the path, partly hidden by pines and brush. It looked old but sturdy. No rot, just weather-worn boards and a sagging porch. The roof looked like it had been patched in spots. A little shed sat to the side, half collapsed. There was a fire pit out front with a few logs for seats, and a thick stack of firewood next to the cabin wall. No one else around for miles. I stepped out of the truck and immediately noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet you only find in the woods. No cars, no voices, just wind brushing through leaves and the distant knock of woodpeckers. It made me feel small. That's the word. Small. Like the trees were towering over me. Like the ground could swallow me up and no one would ever know. Inside, the place was bare but clean. Wood plank floor, a cot with a thin mattress, a little table and chair, the stove and some old shelves. The bathroom was outside, a pit toilet 50 feet into the woods. There was a lantern, a few candles, some matches, and a note with instructions on how to use the well pump and light the stove. For the first day or two, things were exactly what I wanted. I chopped some wood, took short walks around the area, cooked simple meals, read a few pages of an old paperback I found there. I slept early, woke up with the light. I wrote a little in a notebook. It was quiet, still, peaceful. But by the third night, I started to feel off. It began with the footsteps. That night, I was in bed, reading by lantern light, when I thought I heard something outside, a soft crunching, like someone walking slowly through the brush. I turned off the lantern and sat still, trying to listen. At first, I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were steady, slow, and deliberate, and they stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard nothing. I got up, quietly, and looked out through the window. I couldn't see much, just the dark outline of the woods, the fire pit, the path leading away. Nothing moved. I stood there for 10 minutes, but saw nothing. Eventually, I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. I kept imagining someone standing just out of view. In the morning, I found boot prints in the dirt around the side of the cabin. Not mine. They were big, bigger than my size, and deep like the person was heavy. They circled around from the path, went to the window, then back toward the woods. That should have been enough for me to leave. But I told myself it was probably a hunter, someone who wandered too close, maybe checking the cabin out of curiosity. I tried to let it go. I didn't want to ruin the trip. That evening, I kept the lantern burning a little longer, made sure the door was locked, and kept the hatchet close by the bed. I didn't hear anything that night, but I still barely slept. The next morning, I walked around the area again. This time, I found more footprints. They were further out, looping around through the brush. It looked like someone had been watching the cabin from different spots, just standing there. No trash, no shell casings, nothing left behind. Just the tracks. I didn't see any vehicles. No other cabins, no signs of camping. I stayed close to the cabin that day, jumpy at every sound. The wind felt different now. What had felt peaceful now felt heavy, like something was watching from the trees. I kept checking over my shoulder, pausing every few minutes to listen. But there was never anything there. That night, I barely let the lantern go out. I didn't care if it used up all the oil. I kept the hatchet by the bed, my boots on, just in case. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. I turned off the light and sat in the dark, heart pounding. The steps came up to the porch. Boards creaked under the weight. Then a pause. Then something brushed against the door, soft, like fingers. Not knocking, just touching. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then the sound faded. I sat frozen until dawn. When the sun came up, I stepped outside and looked around. No one, but the footprints were there again. This time, they were all over the porch, even right in front of the door. I went back in and packed my bag. I didn't care about the reservation. I just wanted out. But when I turned the key in the truck's ignition, it clicked twice and then went dead. I tried again. Nothing. I opened the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but I could tell someone had been in there. The battery cables were clean cut. Not chewed, not frayed, cut. Clean, straight lines. That meant someone had been close enough to the cabin, in daylight or while I was sleeping, to do that. It also meant someone wanted me to stay. I stood there with the hood open for a long time. Then I closed it, went back inside, and locked the door. I had a decision to make. Wait and hope someone came by or try to walk out. But walking was dangerous. The trail was long, and if someone was out there, they knew the area better than me. They could be watching, waiting. I waited that day, kept low, didn't light a fire, tried not to move much. As night fell, the woods grew louder, wind whipping through the trees, branches snapping. I tried not to think about who was out there. That night, they came back. This time, there was no hiding it. I heard them walking around the cabin, circling slowly. Then something heavy hit the sidewall once, twice. Not enough to break it, just to let me know they were there. I sat in the dark, holding the hatchet, praying for morning. Around 4 a.m., I heard the sound of the shed door slamming open, then silence. When daylight came, I forced myself to go check the shed. Inside, the old tools were scattered across the floor. An axe, some rope, a rusted shovel. The rope was missing. That was the last straw. I grabbed what I could carry, water, matches, a flashlight, the hatchet, and started walking out. I didn't care how far it was. I needed to move. I kept to the trail, eyes on every shadow. For the first few hours, I didn't see anything. But then I saw the tracks again. Off to the side in the soft dirt. The same boot prints, heading in the same direction. They were ahead of me. At that point, I didn't know if I should go back or keep going. I felt sick, dizzy. I pushed on, staying off the main trail as much as I could, taking long detours around curves, checking behind me every few minutes. By late afternoon, I heard a motor. It was distant but real. I followed the sound until I came out to a logging road. A white pickup was parked there, engine running. A guy stood next to it, wearing a vest and holding a map. I didn't ask questions. I just walked out, waved him down, and asked if he could take me to the nearest town. He looked me over, sweaty, shaking, dirty, but nodded. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't say a word during the drive. He dropped me at a diner in the next town over, and I used their phone to call a tow truck for my vehicle. They sent someone out the next day. When they brought the truck in, they confirmed it. Battery cables cut, brake line tampered with. If I'd gotten the engine to turn over and tried to drive, I might have crashed not far down the trail. The police took a report. They asked questions, wrote things down, but said there were no other reports like mine. No known suspects. They checked the cabin, but said they didn't find anything. No tracks, no prints, no tools. It had rained the night I left. Everything was washed away. They told me it was probably just some drifter. Someone messing with me. Said I was lucky to get out. I never went back. I didn't even ask for a refund. I left the keys in an envelope at the station and never looked up the listing again. I still think about it sometimes, how long they were watching, what they wanted, what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. Sometimes I wonder if they were just playing with me. Other times, I think maybe they were waiting for the right night, the right moment, and maybe if I'd stayed one more night, they would have made sure I never left at all.